Hello, and on the gaming table today, we're taking a look at the longer version of the Strength and Honor Battle of Watling Street. So this battle is part of the Boudican revolt that took place in 60 or 61 CE, and it was some miles west of Birmingham. Here I'm going to go over the long version of the battle report I did for the Strength and Honor battle. Probably take about 20 minutes. Let's see how we go. So let's take a look at Boudica's forces to start with. So she has 2 Iceni warbands, 2 Trinovanti warbands, and 2 Artrebates warbands. She's also got some light chariots, 2 light chariots, and light cavalry and skirmishers. Now, all of those ones at the bottom, the light chariots, the light cavalry, and the skirmishers, could break up into skirmish strips to attach to the warbands if she wished. So here are her forces. You can see, as well as the things we listed, she's also got a baggage camp there, and you can see Boudica herself with her Iceni warriors. Now we've got Suetonius Paulinus and his forces. He's got 2 Roman legions, not a very big force, backed up by 2 auxiliaries. Okay. Now he does have 2 small cavalry reserves, but basically he's only got 4 bases here. 2 legions, 2 auxiliaries, and the small cavalry reserves are attachments that provide bonuses, but aren't units in their own right. So you can see his force is quite small in comparison to that of the Britons. As noted in the Strength and Honor rulebook, it says this is a very challenging asymmetrical battle. The Roman force is quite effective, they're quite tough, they have a high combat value and good discipline. The Britons are very numerous, as you can see, but also their discipline is much less, and individually they're less effective than one of the Roman units. So let's see how this goes. So initially we set up the command boards. The Britons are on the top left. They have a breakpoint of 18, and they rolled fairly well for their additional command points that they laid out like so. Pretty balanced sort of approach. The Romans are in the bottom right, and they laid their one out similarly. One mistake they probably made is they probably allocated too many points to movement. They probably should have put maybe 1 more or even 2 more points into attack or defense to help them during the combat engagements. But let's see how it goes. So first, the ancient Britons set up. They started setting up on the right with the chariots, and then moved across to the warbands, the skirmishers, more warbands, light cavalry, and the chariots finally at the end. So as it stands here, we've got in the right of this picture, on the Briton left flank, we've got the 2 Trinovanti warbands, then the 2 Iceni warbands in the middle. They're frenzied warbands, so they have a special ability that lets them basically attack twice with an activation. And on the right of the Briton line, left in the photo, is the Artrebates warbands. Now, after the skirmishers had broken off, that's what the Britons look like. At the top, you can see the Romans deployed at the bottom. Now, the Romans in this battle have a fairly strong defensive position that's anchored on 2 forests. They are basically impenetrable to the chariots. And also they're uphill of the Britons. The little line of stones you can see about 1/3 of the way up the screen there is the edge of the bottom slope of the hill. So everything from that line of stones towards the bottom of the screen is basically uphill. So the ancient Britons will be coming uphill at the Romans, or the Romans can countercharge, as they did historically, downhill into the ancient Britons. So Boudica's here getting ready to send her warbands forward, planning out what she's going to do. Meanwhile, Paulinus is sitting on the hill with a stoic line, again considering what he's going to do. So here we go. In the first turn, the ancient Britons managed to move everything forward. They started by moving the chariots on each side up, and based on how far they moved, they decided whether or not to activate the warbands so that their line didn't get too broken up and staggered. As it was, this is how things ended up. So essentially 2 of the columns, the Trinovanti warbands, and on the left there, and the chariots on the right ended up advancing more than the rest of the line. So this is how things look as they surge across the field. The Romans in their first turn just sat and waited. They don't need to move out of their defended position. They're pretty happy. In the second turn, again, the forces moved up. The Iceni warbands this time getting further ahead of their fellows, but things are generally keeping together here. and the Romans just stayed where they were. So this is one thing about the game, especially when you're closing over this kind of distance. The warbands have relatively variable movement. You don't have much control over it, but the Romans didn't really feel like engaging them, so really it was a couple of turns of letting things come together. In the third turn, the Trinovanti warbands on the left managed to move up. The Atrebates on the right were lagging behind a little, but again, the line's relatively intact and the warbands are basically waiting to get into a good position to start their first charge. Again, the Romans just wait. No point charging down the hill at this stage because that would expose their flanks once they leave protection of the forest if they go a couple of grid squares forward. In this turn, basically, the Atrebates on the right moved up and the rest of the line stayed still. This was basically setting themselves up to get ready for a big concerted charge at the Roman line. And so when the Romans are looking on at this, they can see one potential weak point here is that on the left, those chariots have advanced a little bit further up than they should have in front of the auxiliary here. And so in that turn, the Romans charge down the hill to meet them. And here they have a very good odds, very good combat result here. They get a 3 dice attack in. That 3 dice attack generates a 6. That's a really strong pushback advance result. And it ended up pushing the chariots back. The chariots went back 2 squares. They failed their discipline test and they became disordered as a result. So they picked up 2 setback cards. That's a good start for the Romans. Here the Romans decided to try not to move forward, otherwise they'd be exposing themselves out from the cover of the forest. They succeeded in doing that, and the Roman line is pretty solid. On the right there, the auxiliary with the bronze helmets, as it were, didn't move forward because they could expose themselves to a flank charge by those chariots, but they're still managing in that position where they are to cover the flank of the legion pretty well. So this is how things stand at the beginning of the Britons' turn, and they start to try to charge in here. They move the Trinovanti warbands on the left up to provide support, and then they try to send in the Iceni warbands. Now, the first roll for movement there failed. They didn't get the charge in, so Boudica had to use one of her generalship points to send in the charge, which was successful. Charged in, rolled for combat result, didn't get such a good one, decided to spend an attack point to try that again, and got a much better result the second time, which was not defended by the Roman legion. The Roman legion is then pushed back a square, and they suffered a setback card. However, they passed their discipline test, so they didn't suffer too many adverse effects here. The Atrebates warbands here charged into the legion with a successful roll for movement, and they got a pretty good combat result too as they pushed them back. Here, the Romans decided to try and not break up their line too much. They used one of their command points to hold in place so they didn't get pushed back, and they managed to pass their discipline test. So they picked up one setback card, but it didn't break up their line any and no other adverse results. You can see there that the warbands lost their front row of skirmishers in this fight. Now, with the ancient Britons having exhausted most of their moves, their last move, they decided to try and reform the disordered chariots that were over here on the flank. They managed to get that off. That was not such a high chance of success. I think they needed 8 or more here, but they did manage to pull it off with a 9. And so that unit is now not disordered anymore. It is facing the wrong way. It's currently facing towards the bottom of the screen, but it's got good maneuver, so it should be able to turn itself around and get back into the fight. Over here on the left, the chariots here are wheeled into a position there. They can't enter the forested regions, but there's one grid square where they can get their left-hand edge in, as you see here. That basically means it makes it hard for the Roman auxiliary there to move forward. If those auxiliary move forward, they will be flanked, and that will halve their combat value. So that's kind of just a bit of a blocking position, protecting the flank of the Britons' line should anything adverse happen. And so this is where things stand as the Romans start their next turn. They've got a good option there with the Iceni warband. They can try and push into them. One thing you may have noted, the Frenzied warband, the Icenis didn't get a second combat activation as part of their charge there. They should have. We actually forgot to do that. But there was a couple of other little things that were missed in other places as well. So it didn't matter too much in the end of the day, I think. But anyway, as the Romans stand, here's their options. Those Iceni are a little bit exposed and probably due to be attacked. And so that's exactly what the Romans try. Unfortunately, on a 2-dice attack, they roll double 1s, so they have to use one of their attack points to roll again. This time, a much better result of a 6. which pushes the Iceni back. Now, fortunately for Boudica, she rallied the troops. They did not suffer a failure on the discipline test. Also, she wasn't injured as a result of that. So takes one setback card, but actually falls back into line and no great disorder here. Not really the result the Romans were looking for. They wanted to break up these warbands. The Romans did move up, and that was just to maintain their line so that the legion on the left of the picture here is not too exposed and being attacked by too many warbands all at once. Now, this legion on the left is in a good position with a 2-dice attack to have a go here at the Atrebates warbands. It rolled okay for its attack roll, got a 4, but unfortunately the Atrebates managed to defend that with a 4, so no result from that combat. So this is where things stand. There's a solid crunch of attacks going on in the middle here as the warbands and the legions come together while the auxiliary are on the flanks. The auxiliary on the right not moving forward again because they'll expose their flanks to the chariots. And on the left, the auxiliary don't want to move forward because they'd lose flank protection of the woods. Those chariots now being back in order again in the distance could pose a threat. So now in the Ancient Britain turn, first action here was to charge the Trinobantes into the auxiliary up here. They managed to get that one in, and in a 2-dice attack there was a drawn combat because the Romans managed to defend the attack dice, the 4. Then in the center, Boudica had a little bit of a risk with a 1-dice attack on the Roman legions in the middle here, but fortunately scored a 6, so that wasn't defended by the Romans, and they were pushed back. However, the Romans decided to again spend a defense command point so that they were not pushed back and they stood in line. They did pick up a setback card though. And they managed to pass their discipline test, so no other adverse effects. Over here on the right, the Ancient Britons decided to try and turn their chariots around next. They needed to roll movement points and a maneuver test. They got plenty of movement points with the roll of a 4. That would give them 3 movement points. And then they had to make a maneuver test at a -1 to do an about face. So they managed to pull that off. They've got a 2+. They rolled a 4, no trouble. So they managed to turn around, and also, because they had 3 movement points, they could use their last movement point to advance 1 square forward. So they get back into a good position to cover the flank of those warbands should those auxiliary decide to get any fancy ideas about turning into the flank there. And so that's where things stand at the end of the Britain turn. Over to the Romans. And they begin with a 2-dice attack on the Atrebates warbands, which are on the right of the Britain line, and they manage to push them back. However, the dice roll for pushback is a 1, a no movement, a no pushback. They still do pick up a setback card though, so a little bit more damage done to the Britons. Over here, the auxiliary have a 2-dice attack against the Britons here. The warband at the rear, next to the red dice at the back, cannot provide support because it's in the zone of control of the legion there. So they get a 2-dice attack. The result is a 5. It's not defended. The warbands are pushed back. Once again, they roll high and pass their discipline test, but they have picked up a setback card. And the auxiliary not wanting to move forward pass their discipline test, so they don't have to advance into the gap. So this is where things stand at the end of the Roman turn. Not too much action here, but they did manage to make the Britons pick up a couple more setback cards. Over to the Britons, and the first thing they do is send the Iceni warband into the legions to their front. 2-dice attack here because of the support on the left, and they managed to get a good result, pushing the Romans back and giving them a setback card. The Romans were a little lucky. They have a discipline of 5+, and they rolled a 5. Very close to getting disordered or broken up there. Now, the Iceni have to advance because they're warbands, and they do so, get back into contact. This time we remembered their second attack. Now, unfortunately for the Iceni, they're overextended here. The Legion have support from the auxiliary on their right and the left of the picture here. So this is a 2-dice attack where the Romans get to choose, not the Iceni. So with the Iceni rolling a 4 and a 1 here, and the Romans not choosing the 1 and not defending, that's actually a repulsed result on the Iceni. So they're pushed back and have to take a discipline test. Fortunately, once again, they passed their discipline test. They got driven back quite a bit, but yeah, they're not broken up. They're doing pretty well on these discipline tests. So this is where things stand at the end of the Britain turn. That repulsed result there, giving a reversal of fortune, and the Roman legion choosing to move forward to get back into line with its fellows. That means during the Roman turn, the Atrebates warbands get attacked by the Legion here in a 2-dice attack. However, they manage to defend the 4 that is rolled by the Romans. The Romans decide not to do anything else. To do anything else, they'd have to push forward with different units. They decide not to. They decide to leave it there. Maybe they could have pushed forward on the left with the auxiliary against those chariots there, but it would have only been a 1-dice attack, so a little bit risky. So they sat where they are. Now here, Boudica again revs up her frenzied warbands and sends them charging back in. Gets into combat again, rolls not such a great result, so uses her generalship point to roll that result again, gets a much better result the second time. The Romans don't defend the 5, and they're pushed back. Now, unfortunately, in the discipline tests, the Romans rolled a 4 and failed. Oh no. Even worse, the result of that is a rout. So the Romans pick up a disaster card, and one of their legions has fled the field. With the Iceni moving up into the gap, now the Roman line has fractured and they're in a lot of trouble here. Next, the Trinovanti warband tries to charge in against the auxiliary. A 2 is enough to get them there. And they get a good combat result, which is not defended by the auxiliaries. The auxiliaries are pushed back. They do pass their discipline test, but they've picked up another setback card. So here's how things stand. The auxiliary on the right of the picture are providing support against the Atrebates warbands there. So the Britons decided to try and move the chariots up to basically block the auxiliary. That worked, and then they sent the Atrebates in with a 2-dice attack on the remaining legion. Got a good result that wasn't defended with the 5. And they managed to push them back, although this legion did manage to pass its discipline test, still picking up more setback cards here. So at the end of the Britons' turn, this is where things stand. We've got a very solid line of Britons against a crumbling line of Romans. The Romans, starting to get a little bit desperate now, are trying to do anything to generate some setbacks on their enemy. They try to attack with the legions, roll a 1 initially, use an attack point to re-roll it, get a pushback result, which is not defended. It gives a setback card, but there is no need for a discipline test here. The Romans decided to push up into the gap because it will provide support potentially against other attacks on the left by the auxiliary, but also the Iceni warband on the right of this picture will have a hard time maneuvering to turn into the flank of the legions. The Britons and the warbands are not very good at maneuvers to change direction. So here the auxiliary tried a 2-dice attack on the chariots. They did manage to inflict a good result with the 5. And the chariots are pushed back, but this time the chariots again pass the discipline test. So again, a big string of past discipline tests here for the Britons means the Romans aren't having much luck except inflicting the odd setback card here. Now, at this stage, the Romans were a little bit desperate. They could see the writing on the wall. The Britons only had 8 setback cards, and the Romans would need to get at least 9 points here to inflict any sort of damage, any sort of morale failure onto the Iceni. But if they could get more than 9 with the cards shown here, that would fatigue the Britons. That could make it a little bit more difficult for the Britons to engage them. So they called homunculus est. The Britons declined to use their strategy point to stop that, so they had to reveal, and there was only 8 points here, which was not enough. They needed 10 to get any sort of effect here, so the Britons got slightly lucky perhaps, but in the end, yeah, no result for the Romans, bad luck for the Romans. The Britons here would get to remove one of these cards of their choice. Obviously, they're going to get rid of the 3. Now here, the Britons trying to force the issue are going to charge in and cause a lot more damage here. First, they charge in with the Atrebates on the flank here. Manage to get into the Romans. They have a 2-dice attack here. Again, it's a good result with the 6. And those Romans are driven back. They pick up another setback card. However, they do pass their discipline test. The Trinovanti on the right charge into the Auxilia again here. They get a good combat result with a 5. Push them back. 1 more setback card. The Auxiliary do pass their discipline test though. Now, with the Romans sitting on this number of cards, the Britons decide, okay, it's time to try call homunculus est. This might be enough to break the Romans, and it's putting the Romans in a position where they're probably going to have to spend their strategy point to block this call. And that's exactly what they do. They spend their strategy point, block the call, and we'll wait and see what happens in the next turn. Now, the Britons still have a few options available to them. The blocking of the Homunculus Est call does not trigger reversal of fortune, so the Britons' turn continues. They decide to try and move the chariots here up into the face of the auxiliary, and they manage to do that. No attacks here, it's just blocking them from turning or doing anything else. Now over here, Boudica tries to do something a little bit fancy with the Iceni warband. If she can charge, get enough movement points, and make the maneuver rolls, she can get into the flank of the legions here, which would really cripple the Romans even more than they already are. So to do that, first she needs to get the movement dice to work, and then she'll need to pass a couple of maneuver tests. However, she has got quite a few points on the board still, so it's worth having a go. So they get the number of movement points, they fail the first maneuver check, which is to move through the zone of control of the Romans, spend the movement point, and also fail the second one. So the move doesn't come off, it triggers a reversal of fortune, but really there was nothing else the Britons wanted to do this turn anyway. So play passes to the Romans, and they begin by trying to get into the chariots here. They've got a 2 dice attack. Unfortunately, they rolled double ones and they don't have any more command points to change that result, so this is repulsed. The chariots don't defend that, they wouldn't want to anyway, and so the auxiliary are pushed back. They do pass their discipline test, but that's yet one more setback card for the Romans. Now that does trigger reversal of fortune as well, so that's the end of the Roman turn. Play passes to the Britons, who then try a 2 dice attack against the remaining Roman legion, which has Paulinus inside as well. The Romans don't defend that. Paulinus, getting desperate, tries to spend a generalship point to reroll the defense dice. Still doesn't work, so he's driven back, and fortunately they pass their discipline test, but it's still a setback card. However, there also has to be a roll for Paulinus, as has happened in other situations where units are pushed back. If the general is there, we have to roll to see if the general is injured. In this case, the general is injured. On the roll of a 2, Paulinus is in trouble, and it turns out he's dead. He gets killed in the follow-up by the Atrebates, and that means picking up a disaster card for the Romans. Now at this stage, with no more strategy points to spend and lots of cards here, the Britons decide it's time to call Homunculus Est again. The Romans just have to reveal their cards, and they have lots. They have way more than 20 here when their breakpoint is only 13. So that's victory to the Britons. The course of history changes. The Boudican revolt seems to be successful, and the Romans may be kicked out of Britain. Let me know what you feel about that game there. It was quite interesting to see what happened. Maybe the Romans needed to be a little bit more aggressive. Maybe they shouldn't have had movement points on their board that they didn't spend. But an interesting game nevertheless. Again, very asymmetrical, as was noted. The Romans are a bit hard to break. And honestly, the Britons rolled really well on their discipline tests. Maybe they should have been suffering a lot more poor results there. But that's the way the dice rolls. That's the way the cookie crumbles. So I hope you've enjoyed the longer version of the Battle of Watling Street. This is a really fun game to play, just strength and honor in general, but this scenario is quite good as well. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you again real soon.